So I'm Lisa Reinsberg. I'm with the International Justice Resource Center. I'm very pleased to be here this evening with all of you to have this conversation with Clara Long of Human Rights Watch and Beth Ann Skak, who is at Stanford. And we're going to be discussing the trajectory of human rights, essentially, in the United States in light of recent developments. Kind of personally, and for some of us professionally, we're wondering whether we're witnessing a moment of retreat on human rights by the United States, both at home and abroad. Totally. At home, an example of that is the separation of migrant families at the US-Mexico border. Abroad, an example of that, or in the international arena, is the United States withdrawal from the United Nations Human Rights Council. So that's what we are here to discuss. Clara, we can start here at home. We have seen in the recent months reports beginning back in April, May, of children being separated from their parents upon crossing the southern border. Those families were either entering to seek asylum or were entering without prior authorization. This was part of a zero tolerance policy of criminally prosecuting those who entered without authorization. There are more than 2,500 kids who were in that situation. The government, of course, missed a recent court-mandated deadline to reunify those families, and there are still more than 500 kids who are not with their parents. How did we get here?
Well, we are in many ways witnessing the achievement of some of the worst human rights outcomes of the Trump presidency and Trump policies. But as your question sort of suggests, we're not starting from zero either. The Trump administration inherited an immigration policy framework, a deportation machine that already functioned in ways that implicated massive violations of human rights. And you said these separations were due to a zero tolerance policy that aimed to prosecute everybody who crossed the US-Mexico border. So that was the stated justification by the Trump administration for separating these families. In fact, some of the families who were separated the parents were never sent for prosecution. And then also, as data has been released, it shows that actually, instead of a zero tolerance policy, the policy between in April and May and June of this year was actually a preferential family prosecution policy. Actually, the administration couldn't prosecute everybody who crossed the US-Mexico border and was prosecuting families specifically to separate them and to punish them. All that aside, though, it's not the first time that a U.S. administration has sought to ramp up prosecutions of migrants on the southern border in order to provide what's called in the policy framework of the Department of Homeland Security since 2005, a consequence delivery system to people who cross the border. And that consequence delivery system is one that creates separation of families, already created separation of families, already created a criminalization of migrants and asylum seekers. In fact, prior even to the zero tolerance policy being enacted, about 30% of people who crossed the US border without authorization were being sent to these mass criminal prosecutions for illegal entry or re-entry that are federal criminal statutes. And the zero tolerance policy has increased the proportion of people, about 50% now, who are moving through these prosecutions. But what that means in terms of US policy is actually what the federal criminal justice system does. Actually, more than 50% of the prosecutions being pursued by federal prosecutors are of migrants. And are aimed at criminalizing migration and in many cases sweep up asylum seekers. That's just one part of a a policy framework and a legal framework that has harsh penalties for minor offenses, that criminalizes people trying to return to their families, that provides inadequate chances for asylum seekers to really tell their story and get fair treatment. And one of the sort of silver linings that I'm hoping we can talk about in a couple different ways tonight is that the family separation incident of this year really shines a harsh light on all of that pre-existing framework and allows us to kind of take stock of where we are and where we have been and think about ways that we need to move forward that actually tear down the edifice that the Trump administration built this incredibly harmful policy upon.
So this history is longer than these past 20 months. It hasn't always been protective of migrants' rights. But as is the case in other aspects of the Trump administration, this is different.
Right.
Yeah.
Different and different in a way that allows us to look at also at what allows it to occur, which is indeed this idea that consequences will lead to deterrence of migration, this very alluring idea for policymakers from both parties in this country. And that has actually been proven to be untrue, that these consequences actually don't lead to the control of migration.
Speaking of consequences, Beth, you've been working on a study of the psychological consequences of these family separations on the children and the parents involved. What have you learned about them and about the toll that this has taken?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm affiliated with a lab at Stanford that's a collaboration between me at the law school and the medical school called the Human Rights and Trauma Mental Health Lab. And we look at psychological outcomes of individuals who've experienced extreme trauma, usually in situations in which human rights are being violated, there's an armed conflict situation, situations of repression. And we've had affiliated pediatric psychologists and psychiatrists down on the border interviewing individuals, children, people who are working with the children, and what they're seeing is very consistent with what the literature has already shown us for many years, which is early childhood trauma is very bad for children. It can create all sorts of psychological harm, damage, post-traumatic stress syndrome, anxiety disorder, behavioral disorders, et cetera, that can be very long-term and lasting. Forcible separation from parents is very damaging to children. Same outcomes are seen. And detaining children is very damaging to children. And we have with this policy the confluence of all three of those bad outcomes for children. It's also very harmful on parents. Parents who are going through asylum proceedings or trying to make decisions about their legal options have a very difficult time making clear choices and participating in those legal processes when they're so preoccupied by the fact that they've been forcibly separated from their children. And many parents are actually giving up and waiving potential asylum claims just to get reunited. And as Lisa mentioned, in many cases they're accepting voluntary departure, which would allow them to leave on the assumption that they will get reunited with their children, and then we don't know where their children are, or we can't reunite them, and so they're going home without their children. And now they're separated. And the government has not done a great job of keeping records as to who came with whom, and so there's a chaos of their own making here. And they actually had the audacity to say that, well, the ACLU, and human rights organizations, given all their contacts in Guatemala and Honduras and the places where these people are fleeing from, should figure out where the parents are and should help with the reunions of this. And you know, your point about this consequence-based policy is absolutely right. People are fleeing because they have no other option. They are subjected to extreme violence, forcible recruitment in gangs, sexual violence, repression by governments. That's why they're leaving. No one voluntarily comes and risks bringing their children across an international border, or these coyotes that are bringing people across for frivolous reasons. They're fleeing because they have serious risks and serious fear where they're located. And so changing this policy is not going to necessarily deter individuals. And we do have a whole international framework, the Refugee Convention, which we have signed. We've been a party of that convention for many decades, that obliges us to give individuals the opportunity to apply for asylum, and we're not living up to that obligation.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, the right to seek asylum is a human right. It's also identified in other human rights treaties. And when you talk about the consequences of these policies, at least on the U.S. government side, of detaining children, of separating families, and the impact that that has, it's easy for me to see why people can view these as human rights violations. And you've touched on this in terms of the Refugee Convention, but Clara, can you talk a bit more about what does that mean? What are our government's human rights obligations that are relevant to this context?
Having this be the summer of the family separation crisis for us on the Human Rights Watch immigration team has been a little strange, because we feel like we've been living the decades of the family separation crisis in U.S. immigration policy, because the both the U.S. domestic law and international law prohibit arbitrary, unlawful interferences with the family unit. That's because, as Beth was saying, the family is so important to our psychological makeup, to the ways that we engage with the world, to what we hold dear. And the human rights framework very explicitly protects against interferences with the family that aren't legitimate, that aren't justified by a really weighty government interest. And enforcing immigration law, when there are other ways to enforce immigration law that don't involve separating a family, doesn't live up to a weighty government interest that would really justify separating or tearing apart a family. So, we see that, and just to sort of back up, that's the same international human rights guarantee that's implicated when we talk about the United States' massive deportations of deeply rooted immigrants who have lived in this country for decades sometimes, and whose ties to home and family are not taken into consideration when the U.S. deports them, and has deported 5 million people since 1996. So this is sort of a massive flow of people whose connections to family and connections to home are not weighed by U.S. law and practice.
Mm-hmm. And those standards that you are referring to in terms of respect for family life, respect for family unity, best interests of the child in governmental decisions, a right to be free from arbitrary detention, many other rights. Those are identified, codified in treaties that the U.S. has ratified that are established in international law.
Yeah, that the U.S. has ratified. I mean, the U.S. is the only country now in the world that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Nonetheless, which include many of some of those guarantees that you're talking about, particularly the best interest of children standards. But those standards are so accepted all over the world that international legal scholars, which of whom we have one on the panel and two on the panel, recognize, international legal analysis recognizes that these are rights that are basically guaranteed or should be guaranteed by all governments around the world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So speaking of that international human rights framework and the conventions and the institutions that make it up, we all heard back in June, and as you've seen in the program description tonight, that the U.S. withdrew from the United Nations Human Rights Council in June. And the council is a political organ. It's not responsible for the enforcement or the implementation of any specific human rights treaty. Rather, it's kind of a deliberative body where human rights issues are discussed among states, among government representatives. It can do things like create independent mechanisms to monitor and do fact-finding and make recommendations on specific human rights crises. It's established a range of what are called special procedures for looking at specific human rights issues, freedom of expression, the rights of LGBTI persons, kind of the full range, as well as in specific countries. So that's a body that is kind of the key forum for the discussion of human rights at the global level, and the U.S. is now no longer a part of it. What was UN Ambassador Nikki Haley's justification or rationale for withdrawing? Do you believe her? And why does it matter?
Right. So Ambassador Haley made two primary arguments for withdrawing the United States from the Human Rights Council, which, as you say, is a political body. It's got 47 members. They're voted on by the General Assembly. It's supposed to be, or at least it was designed to be, a kind of a club good, where states would put forward their sort of how they were planning on promoting and advancing international human rights, and it was supposed to keep the sort of bad states off. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite lived up to that full club good ideal, and that was argument number one, is that she said, listen, it's full of human rights abusers, and that is in fact true. Egypt now, Cuba, Venezuela, human rights disaster, right? None of these are necessarily paragons of human rights, and they all currently are sitting on the council. So that's a very true argument, and that's one of the arguments she made. The second argument she made is that it's biased politically against Israel. Israel and the situation in the Palestinian territories is a standing agenda item before the Council. And there is absolutely no question that the Council pays disproportionate attention to that situation as compared to the whole range of other human rights crises around the world, North Korea, Syria, et cetera. Now, the question is, should the United States withdraw because of these two criticisms, valid criticisms of the Council? The reality is, if the United States actually cared about either of those things, it would do much better to stay in the Council than to be on the outside. Even when it comes to protecting Israel, if that's what it cares about, it's better to be on the inside playing a defensive game than sort of picking up your ball and going home and leaving Israel there with no state to necessarily advance its interests in the same way that the United States has been willing diplomatically over the years to do. And there's some indication that Israel is actually quite upset that the United States has withdrawn. So, killing Israel with kindness here. So those are the two rationales. The Human Rights Council, with those valid criticisms, is actually one of the best places to advance human rights in the multilateral system. The two alternatives that Nikki Haley mentioned was that we would do this work in the General Assembly, or we would do this work in the Security Council. And neither one of those can really replace the kind of focused attention that the Council has given to human rights. And the kind of work that the United States historically in the past, and when I was in the State Department, we used to be able to do through the Council. So the General Assembly is enormous, right? There's huge collective action problems there. It's very hard to get the entire Assembly to focus on human rights issues. It can be done. So several years ago, the United States was part of an effort to get an investigative mechanism out of the General Assembly to focus on Syria. So that was a win. We were able to use the General Assembly to do that work. But that's one of many other agenda items that the Assembly is concerned with. Likewise, when it comes to the Security Council, that's really about peace and security. And because China and Russia both have vetoes on that council, they can control what the agenda of the council is going to be. And if an issue comes before it that either of those two states is unwilling to focus on, like Burma, for example, Burma-Myanmar, the council has been very weak on that precisely because China steps in and protects it. Likewise, when it comes to Syria, Russia comes in and protects its ally. So we can't rely on either of those two fora to do what the Human Rights Council can do. I worked on a big initiative when I was in the State Department with Sri Lanka, which had had a horrible civil war, ended with a massacre in 2009, both of civilians and of prisoners of war, individuals that should have been given quarter and weren't. We used the council, we built a coalition, we got some very strong resolution language out of there. We got India to come into the coalition, which is a strong ally and has a lot of influence over Sri Lanka. And eventually Sri Lanka accepted the resolution. It joined the resolution. We were able to do this by building a coalition of like-minded states through the framework of the Human Rights Council. If we're outside the council, we can't do that in the General Assembly. It's just going to be too difficult. And so we've given up the ability to have a tool. And so what I think, sadly, this means is the U.S. really is not that committed anymore to advancing human rights, because why would they pull out of the most effective, if flawed, the most effective mechanism multilaterally that we have?
Can I just, add that the irony is also lost on no one that the announcement of withdrawal came in the moment when the U.S. was receiving
The most
broad
criticism.
international criticism,
Yes.
the most criticism you could probably argue that it has ever received on a human rights issue for the family separation issue, and so, which is an interesting, the aftermath of that is that those two events are kind of linked in the public mind, the withdrawal from the Human Rights Council and the fact that the U.S. was pursuing this family separation policy that's so drastically.
And the council has
violates human
jurisdiction over every state in the world. States have to come forward, they have to report on their human rights records, they get subjected to questions, et cetera. So we haven't avoided that necessarily. They're still going to undertake a review of our policies. But I think the timing is not at all coincidental. I mean, we really were going to be subjected to pretty harsh scrutiny and criticism there. And so there's a piece of that in the withdrawal as well.
So another entity at the United Nations, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Human Rights Chief at the UN, has repeatedly over the past while been referring to this wave of populism, of xenophobia, of nationalism, and the danger that it poses to human rights around the world. He and others have specifically pointed to President Trump, but also to the leaders of other countries like Turkey, Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, as examples of this populism trend and how it can kind of dovetail with this restriction of human rights. Do either of you see what's happening in the U.S. either on the home front or with the withdrawal from the Human Rights Council as part of that trend of populism, as a symptom of this wave?
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, the Trump administration, President Trump is sort of one of the primary exhibits of Exhibit A of the wave of populism, of people who are purporting to speak for a people that is imagined to be white people, a people who doesn't actually represent the majority of this country, but who are sort of drawn and imagined as a majority for whom only President Trump, the populist leader, can interpret their will. And the impact of having a U.S. president who's playing that role, of course, we see that in the domestic policy and in immigration policy, but as you've suggested, it has enormous impacts also in terms of creating a permissive example for people like the Filipino President Duterte, for people who like Viktor Orban of Hungary, who have taken up, for example, the call, the condemnation of so-called fake news. I mean, that in particular has been one that we've seen echoed across the entire world. The idea that populist leaders seem to be able to pass among each other is the idea that the news media is not actually speaking the truth, and that they only can interpret the truth. Unfortunately, yes, I think we're very much facing an existential crisis when it comes to not just the U.S.'s role in the human rights movement, but the human rights movement and the human rights framework itself.
Yeah, there's no question that it's extremely distressing to see our president embracing these authoritarian leaders around the world, which only serves to further embolden them. So he praises President Duterte for his anti-drug policies, which are essentially summary executions. I mean, that's what's happening in the Philippines. It's a state-sponsored policy of summary execution, and we're praising that. Likewise, North Korea. He's sort of hot and cold on North Korea, obviously. It depends on what day, but nonetheless, I mean, that is a regime that a commission of inquiry coming out of the Human Rights Council that the United States was very strong in supporting and standing up, concluded that the entire regime is essentially committing crimes against humanity across that entire country. And yet we are praising that administration. So indeed, it's emboldening, and it's a retreat from, while at the same time we're criticizing our allies. We're criticizing NATO, we're weakening those ties. It's more than curious, it's extremely distressing.
And speaking of authoritarianism, which you've mentioned, we've seen throughout history in times of kind of increased authoritarianism or increased nationalism as well, a rejection of international oversight, of course. And early in the Trump administration, the government failed for the first time in decades to send somebody to represent it before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, our hemisphere, our region's most important human rights oversight body. And then now, of course, they've withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. Do you think we can expect more retreats of that nature, or is there resistance, pushback within the government itself?
I think there is resistance, and we have seen some reversals. I mean, even the family separation policy, right? This administration is not impervious to criticism, and I think this massive international and domestic uproaring. I mean, people, calling their representatives, demanding to know what's going on, demanding to have this reversal. Eventually, it was reversed. There's a disaster that's been left in its wake, and we're still fixing that and cleaning that up. But nonetheless, it's not impervious to that sort of pressure. So I just got sent a really interesting article that was on some nut job sort of website complaining about a former team member of mine from the State Department who was undermining Trump's policy in Guatemala. Why? Because he was down there with the ambassador showing support for a case involving the violence from the Dirty War era that had gone to a judgment and individuals had actually been prosecuted after decades for disappearances, mass rape, et cetera. And because here we were providing support for that, that was being deemed on this website as sort of undermining Trumpian policies. But the point is, there are still really good people in the State Department who are career diplomats, who understand the value of multilateral engagement, who understand that it's always better to be in the room than to be out of the room, who understand that these are tools that are advancing U.S. interests, including national security interests. If you look at the two universes of states, states where the highest risk coming to the United States and states with the worst human rights records, there's almost a complete overlap between those two subsets. And so promoting human rights, the benefit, the welfare of women, of children, of fairness, rule of law, et cetera, has a direct bearing on national security within the United States. There are people still in the government who understand that. Mm-hmm. Not everybody has been run out of town. So I'm hopeful that those people are still trying to exercise influence internally to say, listen, these tools actually do work. We don't want to throw out every baby with all of the bathwater necessarily.
So there may be some hope there. In terms of civil society, so outside of government, in the human rights field, the tactic of naming and shaming is a well-known and often used one of putting a spotlight on and publicly calling out the government's policies, practices that are harmful to human rights. However, it has been said, many people are saying, that perhaps Donald Trump has no shame. So how can you go about effectively naming and shaming, or what other tactics might you need as a human rights advocate or person in this era in order to try to get the government to change policies that we believe are harmful to human rights?
You can shame the shameless, it turns out. I mean, that's what we've learned this summer. That's possible. I've spent my summer back and forth from Central America looking for and speaking with some of the deported parents who were separated from their children who remained detained inside the United States, and also doing interviews with detained asylum seekers, separated families in various detention centers in the United States. And at some point this summer, I ended up in Portland, Maine, which is where my partner is from, and I ended up at a Families Belong Together rally in the widest state in the United States, where nearly 1,000 people had gathered at the State House, and one of them was holding a sign that said, "U.S. immigration policy violates human rights," and it moved me to tears. I have to say, to feel like we were not alone, that there was a popular recognition that the rights violations that were occurring now, and that are of course connected to rights violations that have occurred in the past, violate the standards that people in this country value. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the opportunity that we have to seize in this moment. The opportunity to really embrace, as a U.S. civil society, a human rights framework. And to look at the ways that that framework helps us conceptualize what we value and helps us to achieve what we value in collaboration with other nations.
I see it as sort of part of a multi-pronged strategy where taking to the street is one thing we have to keep doing. Sometimes you have to just stand up and be counted. And I tell that to my kids when we come up to the city and do various things, or in Oakland or in San Jose or whatever. Number two is this reporting that groups like Human Rights Watch do, the naming and shaming. We have to keep doing it, right? If we turn away from it, it's going to continue to flourish. So the only way to get it reversed is to shed that harsh light on it and call it what it is and point out what rules it's violating under domestic law, under international law, whatever body of law you have available to us. And I think there's also a litigation strategy. And so organizations are out there, the ACLU and others, who are doing litigation. And they're getting some results. Even with the family separation policy, there are some judges that are saying, listen, there are rules that apply to how long you can detain children, et cetera. It's generally being adjudicated under domestic law frameworks. They're not using necessarily international law, but many groups and academics like myself are submitting a brief that will go in parallel with the domestic law brief. And so generally these judges are going to decide this on domestic law. But the fact that these outcomes are consistent with international human rights, I think is helpful. And so, and then we have to vote, right? We have to get out the vote. We have to get the House back. There's a whole political strategy, like a raw sort of fight, knockdown, drag out political strategy. And we have to be available to use all of these tools across the spectrum to keep us on the rails, as it were.
Absolutely. So there's no silver bullet in human rights advocacy.
No.
And yeah, we have to use all the tools at our disposal, all the opportunities. I wanted to mention one opportunity that is coming up in October. The InterAmerican Commission on Human Rights, again, that regional human rights oversight body, will be in session actually for the first time ever in Colorado, so relatively nearby. And it's pretty certain that they will be hearing some of these issues and will be asking the U.S. government to be at this hearing publicly, kind of defending itself, answering questions about immigration-related policies and perhaps other human rights issues as well. And I think if people are aware of those things happening, this is something that happens, by the way, twice a year, at least every year in these public sessions. But if people are aware that that's happening, if they can convey to their media outlets, to their representatives, that they care about these mechanisms of oversight, then I think that adds to that toolkit, those options that we all have for trying to move the needle.
And the Inter-American Commission is incredibly important. It's one of the few multilateral oversight bodies that we're automatically subjected to in terms of jurisdiction. It's not an opt-in kind of a mechanism, which we generally don't do if that's the option. By virtue of being a member of the Organization of American States, the political body, we are subjected to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And the Commission uses regional human rights treaties as the standards against which it measures U.S. policy and other policy in this hemisphere. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what sort of a delegation the United States sends. They can't really they could ignore it, I suppose, but then they can't stop it, right? It's going to move forward and have this hearing right here in our backyard, which is quite interesting.
And there was enough of a kind of a backlash too when they failed to appear at the first hearings convened during the Trump presidency, specifically on a hearing on the Muslim ban and another hearing as well. There was enough of a pushback to that now they have been coming to the table. So we do expect that they'll be there in Colorado. Well, thank you both for answering all of my questions. We now have some questions that we've been collecting from the audience. And let me look through these quickly. But Clara, let's start maybe with you on this. In terms of domestic law, the statutory changes that would be necessary to prevent these discretionary seeming policy decisions like family separation. What needs to change to stop that?
A lot needs to change. If I were going to make sort of a wish list about ways in which we could address human rights issues in the immigration system, I would start with drawing down the sprawling and abusive immigration detention system, which holds now about 500,000 people a year in over 200 facilities all around the United States. These facilities lack oversight. We've documented how deaths in the facilities are linked to inadequate medical care. The detention is the way in which the U.S. pursues its hardline border policies. So if you can't detain, you have to find some way to provide due process and enforce the rule of law outside of a system that forcibly basically separates people from all resources that they might be able to access to get due process and fairness in their claims. The detention system is huge. So that means restricting the use of a fast-track deportation procedure at the border called expedited removal. It means removing overbroad so-called mandatory detention provisions in immigration law. It sounds a little bit out of touch to say this, but the U.S. very urgently needs to pursue a mass legalization program. One of the things that we've documented in our data analysis work in terms of government data at the border is that 15%, 15% of the people who are crossing the border in the most recent data that we have are actually people who have U.S. citizen children already. So a significant proportion of the flow of people across the border are people who are just trying to get back to their families. They need to be included along with the 11 million others who are living in the United States in a program that actually just regularizes people who we know are here, are contributing to communities, are loved by their family members, and need legal status to show that. There are statutory changes within the U.S. asylum adjudication system that probably are a little bit too complex to go into, but that really need to tend towards an efficient and fair system that would eliminate a 700,000 case backlog, which means that the first immigration hearing that you can get sometimes on your asylum case is 5 years in the future. These are in front of courts that are underneath the Department of Justice, now run, of course, by Jefferson Sessions, who is doing all that he can in that position to remove any sort of semblance of impartiality or justice from these courts. So you probably want to move to an Article I system where the courts are not under the Department of Justice, not under a political appointee. There are a lot of ideas in Washington about how to fix the immigration system, and a lot of people actually agree with them. Not too long ago, in 2013, the Senate voted overwhelmingly for a proposal that, to be fair, would not have fixed many of the problems on the border and would have made them worse, but would have done some of these other things that I'm talking about, would have protected children more than children are now protected, would have helped to draw down detention, would have provided this mass legalization program. And the House never voted on it. And so that's why it was never signed. So it's not like it's so out of reach. And one of the things I try to remember in this moment in history, and I try to think about this often, is that Rebecca Solnit, who are our San Francisco co-resident here, has said that change is not necessarily linear. Mm-hmm. And that we feel like, and we very much are living in this moment of an enormous step backwards, but that doesn't mean that an enormous step forward can't happen in a way that we can't really foresee right now.
And it sounds like you're talking about changes in the law, in policy and practice, but maybe also a need for additional resources.
Actually, you saying that makes me want to say one more thing, which is that actually it's a need for drawing down resources more than anything else. One of the things that people have, that many people across different, in different parts of society have picked up in this summer is this call to abolish ICE. And whatever you think about that, it does point to something that is really important about the immigration enforcement apparatus in the United States, which is that since 1996, the proportion of the federal budget dedicated to immigration enforcement has increased 7 times and has created these immigration shock troops of tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of agents and officers who are dedicated to a government function that, while it might be legitimate in some form, becomes illegitimate because it is applied massively to people for whom the government has really no interest in detaining and deporting. I think what's interesting about the Abolish ICE call is that it really does point to the extent of reform that's needed in terms of where the federal government puts its resources.
We have a question about another area of international law, international criminal law, and whether what's happening at the border amounts to crimes against humanity, and if so, what mechanism is there for the adjudication of those issues?
It's an interesting question. So crimes against humanity is an international offense that's really a constellation of offenses that are made criminal under international law if they're committed in the context of a widespread or a systematic attack against a civilian population. And so if we think about this process in the aggregate, it does start to approach that notion. And the enumerated acts of crimes against humanity are everything from sort of arbitrary detention, murder, extermination, things we're not necessarily seeing, but also various forms of cruel treatment, sexual violence, and torture. And so, particularly when you're dealing with family separations and some of the conditions that children are being placed in, you start to approach a situation that looks like it could be torturous, or at least cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, which is a sort of a continuum of which torture is the most extreme. You don't have to show necessarily state action for crimes against humanity, but we clearly have that here. For torture, you have to show some sort of a surplus of intent, the intent to punish someone, intent to discriminate, et cetera. As Clara mentioned, I mean, some of the early rationales for this policy have been expressly punitive. You're punishing people who have come in an irregular way, right, without authorization, and you're also then trying to deter others by virtue of punishing the children of the parents who have broken the law. Of course, the children can't consent to break the law necessarily. They've just come with their parents. And so it does start to look like these more extreme violations that you're seeing elsewhere. There's no kind of court that would necessarily have jurisdiction over that. We have seen claims brought against Australia, which is a member of the International Criminal Court. With respect to their immigration policy, they have used some of the outer islands that are sort of protectorates of Australia to essentially warehouse migrants that are coming from, towards Australia from often Asia and elsewhere, under very abject conditions, virtually no ability to apply for asylum. People are being sent back. People are being mistreated while they're in detention. And that some claims have been alleged by, including my law school's human rights clinic, have filed claims before the International Criminal Court's prosecutors saying, listen, you should look at this, and you should look at this under the framework of crimes against humanity. Now, to date, she's declined to move forward on that. Australia is sort of a member of good standing in the international community. There's been some amelioration, not probably enough of the situation, but the International Criminal Court is sort of hovering over Australia there. The United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, so we don't have a supranational body necessarily. But that language can be useful, I think, when we're looking at such widespread violations. And we've had some of these court cases have really revealed some very disturbing realities. So children being forcibly medicated, not using psychotropic drugs, not because they have a psychiatric disorder, but simply to pacify them because they're so upset by the situation in which they've been put and the fact that they've been forcibly separated from their parents. Extreme temperatures, nothing but a cookie for dinner. I mean, these testimonies that you read that have been put into the record as part of this class action suit that, as Clara mentioned, started well before the Trump policy, but now has become a class action and has encompassed this new policy. It's really disturbing to see some of the conditions under which children, young children, are being held in our name.
I think it's true that the parallels with the Australian context are remarkable. Sticking with this topic of accountability, either of the U.S. government as such or of individual actors within the government for implementing these policies, we know that there are a range of lawsuits happening across the country. It's a lot to delve into, but what are your thoughts on the likelihood of success of those pieces of litigation, and what can we expect to see in terms of accountability through the courts?
Well, it's flummoxing that no one really has had to answer yet for the family separation policy, and that according to to public reporting, there's a council of people in the White House led by Stephen Miller who are still meeting every week to try to figure out how they can kind of do it again, and that their conclusion thus far is that they just didn't really think about how to do it. They didn't give it enough thought beforehand, but they're going to sort of, as they did, Muslim ban 2.0, 3.0, give it another shot. And probably another shot is going to look like an enormous increase in family detention, and an attempt to rewrite rules that currently under one of these class action suits limit the amount of time that families can be held in detention. So without the accountability that you're talking about, we have the same actors pursuing essentially the same policy by other means, and they will continue to do so as long as there's not accountability. When it comes to the reunification and treatment of the nearly 3,000 families that were subject to separation over the course of last year and this year, I think there's a pretty positive prospect when it comes to reunifying families who are in simple reunification situations. For example, I was in Guatemala week before last, looking for and connecting with families who still have their kids detained in the U.S. And for some of them who have sometimes very small kids detained in the U.S., the choice is very simple. We want our kids back now. And the class action lawsuit that's being litigated by the ACLU is very clear. They should get their kids back. Yeah. But I was also in Honduras this summer speaking with parents in similar situations. And for some of them who I spoke with, and there are, of course, also people who are asylum seekers in Guatemala, but probably a smaller proportion. Some of the Hondurans who I spoke with actually were facing death threats, as you've mentioned, and their children were also under threat. And they told the court, actually, I don't want my child back because I don't want my kid to face the threats that we fled. And so for those people, the current, the judge in the Ms. L case, which is the class action case dealing with family separation, actually hasn't really indicated which way she'll go in terms of providing them relief. And I think that's the big question mark in terms of, if we're talking really about that class of people who were separated under zero tolerance. What about the people whose asylum claims were ignored, dismissed, and they were separated from their kids through deportation?
And at the regional level or the supranational level, in terms of accountability mechanisms that might exist, we've talked about the InterAmerican Commission. The Human Rights Council is still on the table in terms of the oversight that it does of UN member states generally, including through the Universal Periodic Review process that you mentioned. What are the prospects for success in that realm in terms of actually changing policy and practice in the short term? Are there examples of that working effectively in the past?
So, the problem with so many of these multilateral or even regional mechanisms is they're not strictly binding in the same way that a court order is binding. That's the nice thing about litigation, is it actually is a tool, that it's a strong lever, that if you can get an outcome, if you can get a win for the plaintiffs, and your point is really a good one, like what does win look like for these people? And they're in a class, but they all have different circumstances, right? And they may think differently about what is the best outcome for them as a family, and trying to get a piece of litigation to sort of reflect that heterogeneity is really, really tricky. So that's the negative of litigation. At the international or regional level, it's more symbolic. I hate to admit that, but it really is. There isn't any oversight necessarily, or tools or remedies that can be suggested, they can be awarded, but they won't. There's no way to enforce those. They're essentially unenforceable. So, but it moves then into the diplomatic realm. And so you get a judgment or an opinion from the InterAmerican Commission of Human Rights that says the family separation policy violates human rights, which of course is probably what they will determine. So then other states that have an ability to influence us one way or the other can say, listen, this is really a problem. We're also members of the Organization of American States. You have trade desires, or there's something you want from us. Well, we're going to build this into our bilateral diplomatic relationship, and it's going to be something you're going to have to answer to. So it becomes part of a conversation that's happening at higher and higher levels. So it's a slow and gradual process, but these judgments, these outcomes, these opinions are tools. They're authoritative, they're symbolic, they're usually very well reasoned, they consider all the counter arguments and they undermine them and they come up with their outcome, and then other diplomats can then use those tools. So that's where we're left with, essentially, is the rest of the international community going to be willing to bake this problem into their bilateral relationship with the United States? The reality is we're alienating so many former allies, so many other multilateral regional organizations, et cetera, that we're at the point where we're a little bit of a target, I think. Mm-hmm. Other groups are banding together to have a counterweight to the role that the United States used to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's not that defense around us that there used to be. And the human rights mechanisms, I think, have a number of tools at their disposal, like the hearings, like the complaint processes that exist, especially at the Inter-American Commission, where it is similar. It is a quasi-judicial proceeding, but then you don't get the legally binding judgment. You just get a favorable, usually, decision that, as Beth is saying, gives you this legal foundation to then, maybe when the conditions change, say this is what we should be aiming for. And you see that happen in other places, more so than to date here in the United States, but in countries like Guatemala and Colombia, where there's a reckoning for past crimes. Those national courts are looking to the decisions of these regional or supranational human rights bodies and saying we need to hold these individual perpetrators of these crimes accountable, and they're doing that, and it's on the basis of, in large part, these decisions coming from the international level. So when the situation changes, you can use those documents, even if it's not for a while, and even if it takes a while to get them themselves. It can be useful in that way. There's also the airing out of issues as well. For example, we had recently a visit from the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty, which was, I thought, a useful way of getting attention on an issue in the United States that maybe wouldn't have otherwise had that media coverage, both within the United States and around the world, about socioeconomic inequality and poverty as human rights concerns.
And that was a hard-hitting, explosive report that, ironically, as well, was released right around the time of the U.S. withdrawal.
Mm-hmm. Right. So looking to the future, thinking about maybe these human rights, these engagements with human rights bodies being a form of laying the groundwork for another day, what does the post-Trump era look like? Will we be able to, collectively speaking, regain the ground lost in the human rights front?
I fear that some of the damage is indelible. I mean, after 9/11, there were a whole range of dimensions in which we retreated from human rights values. And in many respects, we turned those around. Even during the Bush administration, mm-hmm. The Bush administration realized that these were counterproductive. I mean, Guantanamo stands as sort of stark counterexample to that. But in other areas, we did turn some of that around. And then President Obama was elected, and we were sort of re-embraced by the international community. And he was not perfect, as you have discussed. There were, issues with that administration. But there was a sort of coming back into the fold. But we've done a lot of damage in a short 2 years, and so I am concerned about that. Now, all that said, Samantha Power, who used to be the ambassador to the United Nations in New York, gave a talk at Stanford last year, and she premised it on a series of quotes that if heard today could very much speak to this particular administration. And what she said was actually no, one was from the McCarthy era, one was from the Korematsu decision, right, the decision to intern Japanese Americans during World War II, and one was around the HIV crisis and the sort of, the fact that we basically ignored that crisis for so long because it originally impacted only gay men, or primarily gay men in the beginning. And for each one of those, we have realized the errors of our ways, and the courts have stepped in, and the political mechanisms have stepped in, and those errors are object lessons, right? Things to be avoided. Now, sadly, we're sort of cycling back toward them. The McCarthy era issues, there's echoes of that in some of the language about the press being the enemy of the people, et cetera. The detention issues are sounding very much like Korematsu again. But we learned some lessons during those eras, and we learned lessons during the civil rights era, et cetera. And it is cyclical, and progress goes and starts and stops. And it's galvanized, I think, much of the American people. I mean, people are taking to the streets, people are working with civil society organizations, they're mobilizing. And so, if we're looking for silver linings, those are some that I think we can cherish and celebrate.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess I'm in this, from where I'm sitting, the destruction of US exceptionalism might not be such a bad thing. Especially if the people who are in the streets and who are demanding change from the government, and who are demanding, a government that respects individual rights, also recognize that means that the United States needs to bind itself to the international order that's governed under human rights, because in very important ways, historically, the U.S. has not accepted that international order, is not a member of the ICC, hasn't signed.
Keep a foot out all the time.
Keep a foot out.
Yeah.
And so, if we're going to play the silver lining out and really believe in it, then let's also hope that that the people who if the people win and push back successfully against populism, that they also ask for the U.S. to not be exceptional and to not be given a pass from being a member and being subject to these to human rights bodies, because supposedly there's some inherent goodness in this country. Because I think we've unfortunately learned that there's not.
Well, on that note, we will conclude this portion of our program. I want to say thank you so much to Beth and to Clara and to all of you for being here.
Great questions.